The carriage wheel cracked against a stone in the road, and Eleanor Ashworth gripped the seat with both hands, her heart pounding faster than the sound of the horses outside. She had been watching the road behind them for the last hour, certain that another carriage was following at a careful distance. She did not know the man's face, but she knew the shape of danger, and it had followed her family for 3 years now. She pulled the curtain closed and pressed her back against the leather seat, forcing her breathing to slow. Her trunk sat across from her, locked twice, holding everything she owned in the world, including a small silver locket she never opened where others could see. Inside that locket was a face she could not risk anyone recognizing. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The letter in her lap had come from a house called Greythorne Hall, offering a position as a companion to an elderly lady with failing eyes. It was a small position, an unimportant one, the kind of work that drew no attention and asked no difficult questions. That was exactly why she had answered it. A woman running from her past could not afford to be noticed. She needed to disappear into ordinary life, and a great house full of servants, where one more quiet woman would blend into the walls, seemed like the safest place left to her. She had written the letter of reference herself, copying the careful, looping hand of a woman she had once known, praying that no one at Greythorne Hall would think to write back and check. It was a risk, but every choice left to her now was a risk. 3 years ago, her father had been a respected solicitor in London, trusted with the finances of half a dozen noble families. Then the accusations began. Forged signatures, missing funds. A scandal that grew louder every week until her father was arrested, and within months, he was gone, leaving behind debts that were not entirely his own, and enemies who believed she knew where hidden money was kept. She did not know where any money was kept, because there was no hidden money. Her father had been used, blamed for crimes committed by men more powerful than him, men who wanted a name to punish so their own names would stay clean. When he died in a cold cell before his trial could even begin, those men did not stop looking for what they believed she had. They believed the daughter would know the secrets the father had taken to his grave. So Eleanor Ashworth became, for the world, Eleanor Hartley. She burned the letters that carried her real name. She learned to answer to a different one without flinching, a skill that took months of quiet practice in front of a cracked mirror in a rented room. She learned to walk like a woman with nothing to hide, even when her hands trembled at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps on a staircase. The carriage slowed as it turned through a stone gate, and Eleanor allowed herself to look out at last. Greythorne Hall rose ahead of her, grand and gray under a sky heavy with clouds, its windows catching the last light of the afternoon like watching eyes. It was larger than she had imagined, the kind of house that belonged to old money and older secrets of its own. For a moment, she wondered if she had traded one danger for another, whether a house this large, home to a duke, would draw exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid. But there was no turning back now. The carriage rolled to a stop, and a footman opened the door, offering his hand. She took it, stepped down onto the gravel, and lifted her chin the way she had practiced, the way a companion with nothing to fear would carry herself. A housekeeper named Mrs. Whitfield met her at the entrance, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she missed very little. She looked Eleanor over from her boots to her bonnet, and for one terrible second, Eleanor feared she had already been seen through. "You are younger than I expected," Mrs. Whitfield said. "I have been told that before," Eleanor answered, keeping her voice light. "I promise I am capable of the work." Mrs. Whitfield's mouth did not soften, but she nodded once and led Eleanor inside. The hall was cool and echoing, lined with portraits of stern faces in old clothing, and Eleanor kept her eyes forward, refusing to let herself be unsettled by painted eyes that seemed to follow her down the corridor. "Lady Millicent," the housekeeper explained as they climbed the stairs, "is the Duke's aunt. Her eyes have grown weak these past 2 years, and she needs someone to read to her, to walk with her, to keep her company through the long afternoons. She is sharp of mind you, sharper than most who still have their sight. Do not think her age makes her simple. It does not. I would not assume such a thing," Eleanor said. "See that you don't," Mrs. Whitfield replied, and there was almost the ghost of approval in her tone. They reached a set of doors at the end of a long hallway, and Mrs. Whitfield knocked twice before opening them without waiting for an answer. Inside, seated near a tall window with pale curtains, was an elderly woman with silver hair pinned neatly and hands folded over a walking stick resting against her chair. Her eyes, though clouded at the edges, turned toward the door with surprising precision. "You walk quietly for someone unfamiliar with this house," Lady Millicent said before anyone had spoken a word of introduction. "Come closer, girl, so I might hear your voice properly. My eyes are poor, but my ears have grown sharper for it." Eleanor stepped forward and offered a small curtsy out of habit, though she knew the old woman could not see it. My name is Eleanor Hartley, my lady. I have come to be your companion, if it pleases you. Lady Millicent tilted her head, listening the way a person listens when they are searching for something hidden beneath the surface of a voice. A companion, she repeated slowly. We shall see about that. Sit down, child. Tell me where you learned to speak with such care in your words. Servants rarely bother, but you have. That interests me a great deal. Eleanor felt a small flicker of alarm beneath her calm expression. She had not expected to be studied so closely on her very first afternoon, and she reminded herself silently that a companion's task was simply to answer, not to explain herself. I have always enjoyed reading, my lady. Perhaps it shows in how I speak. Perhaps, Lady Millicent said, though her tone made it clear she was not entirely convinced. She gestured toward a chair near her own, and Eleanor sat, folding her hands the way she had practiced for weeks, calm on the outside no matter what storm moved beneath. They spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet conversation, Lady Millicent asking careful questions about books and news from London, listening more than she spoke, and Eleanor answering with practiced ease, giving away nothing that could be traced back to her true name. By the time the light outside had turned to a deep orange, Eleanor believed she had passed the first test of many still to come. It was as the sun began to set that she heard the sound of hooves on the gravel path below, followed by voices in the entrance hall, one of them low and unfamiliar, carrying the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed. Lady Millicent's head lifted at the sound. That will be my nephew, she said. The Duke has returned early from London. He was not expected until next week. Eleanor's stomach tightened without warning. A man returning early, unannounced, was not something she had prepared for. She had counted on days, perhaps a full week, to settle into her role before facing the master of the house himself. Now he was already here, his footsteps rising steadily up the staircase outside the door. She stood quickly, smoothing her skirts, arranging her face into practiced calm, though her pulse beat hard enough that she feared it might somehow be visible. The door opened, and a man stepped inside, tall, dressed for travel rather than formal company, his dark coat still carrying the dust of the road. His eyes moved first to his aunt, softening with clear affection, and then to Eleanor, where they lingered a moment longer than politeness required. Sebastian, Lady Millicent said warmly, holding out a hand toward him. You are early. The roads were kinder than expected, he answered, crossing the room to take her hand gently. And who is this? This, Lady Millicent said, is Miss Hartley, my new companion. She arrived only this afternoon, and already she has proven far more interesting than the last three combined. The Duke's gaze returned to Eleanor, and for a moment, something in his expression shifted, quiet, searching, the way a man looks at a puzzle whose pieces do not quite match the picture on the box. Eleanor lowered her eyes and offered a proper curtsy, hoping the gesture would end his attention before it went further. Welcome to Greythorne Hall, Miss Hartley, he said, his voice steady and low. I hope you find the house comfortable. Thank you, Your Grace, she answered, keeping her voice even despite the tightness in her chest. He did not look away immediately. There was something in the way she held herself, something too composed, too careful for a woman who had spent her life in service, and though he said nothing more, Eleanor felt certain, with a cold and quiet dread, that the Duke of Greythorne had already begun to notice more than she wished him to see. That night, alone in the small room given to her near Lady Millicent's chambers, Eleanor sat by candlelight and opened the locket at last, staring at the small painted face inside, a face that belonged to a life she could never fully leave behind. She closed it quickly at the sound of footsteps passing in the hallway outside her door, her heart still racing long after the sound had faded into silence, and she wondered, not for the first time, how long she could keep pretending to be someone she was not, in a house where the man who owned it already seemed to be watching far too closely. A week had passed at Greythorne Hall, and Eleanor had begun to believe, foolishly perhaps, that she was safe. The days settled into a quiet rhythm of reading aloud to Lady Millicent, walking the garden paths at her side, and taking meals apart from the family as a companion was expected to do. But safety, she had learned long ago, was rarely as solid as it felt in the moment, and on the 8th morning, she woke to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her window, and a strange, sinking certainty that her quiet week had come to an end. She dressed quickly and made her way down the servants' staircase, only to find Mrs. Whitfield speaking sharply to a young footman near the kitchen door. A rider had arrived before dawn, the housekeeper was saying, carrying word that guests would be joining the house for a hunting party within the fortnight, guests of considerable importance, including men from London whose names Mrs. Whitfield spoke with clear unease. Eleanor felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. Men from London. She did not yet know who they were, But the mere mention of the city was enough to set her nerves on edge. London was where her father had died. London was where the men who blamed her still lived, still searched, still waited for a chance to find what they believed she was hiding. She forced herself to breathe evenly and continued on toward Lady Millicent's chambers, reminding herself that London was a large city, full of countless men, and that a hunting party at a duke's estate did not automatically mean danger had found her. Still, the fear did not fully leave her chest for the rest of that day. It was 2 mornings later that she first noticed the Duke watching her with real intention, rather than simple curiosity. She had been reading to Lady Millicent in the small sitting room when Sebastian entered quietly, taking a seat near the window with a ledger in his hands, though Eleanor noticed he read very little of it. Instead, his eyes moved often toward her, studying the way she held the book, the way her voice shaped certain words with a precision that came from years of proper schooling, rather than a life spent in service. When the reading ended and Lady Millicent dozed lightly in her chair, as she often did in the warm afternoons, Sebastian rose and crossed the room toward Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "You read Latin," he said quietly, not quite a question. Eleanor's hands stilled on the pages. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace? I saw you in the library 3 nights ago," he continued, his voice low so as not to wake his aunt. "You were reading a text in Latin, and reading it quickly, without struggle. That is not a common skill among companions, Miss Hartley." Her mind raced for an explanation, something simple, something that would not invite further questions. "I had a tutor once," she said carefully. "My family valued education, even with little money to spare for it." Sebastian studied her for a long moment. There was no accusation in his gaze, only a quiet, careful attention that unsettled her more than anger would have. "Many families value education," he said finally. "Few succeed in providing what you clearly possess." He paused. "I do not say this to trouble you. I say it because I find myself curious, and I am a man who does not enjoy leaving a question unanswered." "Then I am afraid you may be disappointed, Your Grace," Eleanor said, forcing a small polite smile. "I am simply a companion, nothing more interesting than that." He held her gaze a moment longer, and something in his expression told her he did not believe the answer, though he chose, for now, to let it rest. He inclined his head politely and left the room, and Eleanor exhaled slowly once the door had closed behind him, pressing a hand briefly to her chest to steady her racing heart. Over the following days, small moments accumulated, each one a thread that Sebastian seemed determined to follow, whether he realized it fully or not. He noticed the way she instinctively lowered her eyes and inclined her head at the mention of a particular noble family visiting London that season, a gesture too practiced, too deeply ingrained, for a woman with no connection to such circles. He noticed the fine, careful stitching on the collar of her one good dress, work far beyond what a servant's wages could afford, work that spoke of a woman once accustomed to far better than she now wore. He noticed, most of all, the way her hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat whenever a stranger's name was mentioned in passing, as though she were checking that some private truth remained safely hidden away. Despite his growing suspicion, Sebastian found himself, against his own better judgment, drawn to her rather than wary of her. There was something in the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, something in the patient kindness she showed his aunt, reading for hours without complaint, adjusting her voice gently when Lady Millicent grew tired, that spoke of genuine goodness rather than calculated deception. He had spent enough years managing an estate full of people with hidden motives to recognize the difference between someone hiding a scheme and someone hiding a wound. Eleanor, for her part, found herself equally troubled by her growing feelings toward the Duke. She had expected, when she took this position, to remain invisible, unremarkable, a quiet shadow moving through the edges of a great house. She had not expected the master of that house to seek her out in the evenings under the pretense of discussing his aunt's health, lingering afterward to ask her opinion on a book he had read, or to notice, with visible concern, the days she seemed paler and more tired than usual after a sleepless night spent fearing the sound of carriage wheels on the road outside. "You seem troubled, Miss Hartley," he said to her one evening as she stood alone on the terrace, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. "Is something weighing on you?" "I am only tired, Your Grace," she answered, though the lie felt heavier each time she spoke it. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she was aware of his presence but not so close as to seem improper. "If you were troubled by something more than tiredness," he said carefully, "I hope you would know that this house, and the people in it, are not unkind. Whatever burden you carry, Miss Hartley, you need not carry it entirely alone." For a brief, dangerous moment, Eleanor considered telling him everything, the truth of her name, her father's ruin, the men who still hunted for secrets she did not possess. But fear held her tongue. Fear that even a kind man's sympathy could not protect her from powerful enemies. Fear that the moment he knew the truth, he would be forced to choose between protecting her and protecting the reputation of his own family name. "I thank you for your concern, Your Grace," she said instead, forcing lightness into her voice. "But truly, there is nothing more than a tired mind after a long week." He did not press further, though the look he gave her before returning inside told her clearly that he did not believe the answer, and that his patience, though genuine, was not endless. Meanwhile, Lady Millicent, whose failing eyes seemed to conceal a mind sharper than most in the house realized, had begun quietly forming her own conclusions. During one particular afternoon, as Eleanor read aloud from a volume of poetry, the old woman interrupted mid-sentence. "You read that line the way my own mother used to read it," she said thoughtfully. She had the same habit of pausing just before the final word, as though giving it space to breathe. "It is not a common habit, Miss Hartley. It is one taught, carefully, in households that valued such details. Households very much like the ones I once moved among in my youth." Eleanor's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Perhaps I simply enjoy poetry, my lady." "Perhaps," Lady Millicent said, in a tone that made clear she suspected far more than she chose to say aloud just yet. "But I have lived a long life, child, and I have learned that the truth reveals itself eventually, whether we invite it to or not. I find I am in no hurry to force it. I would rather let it arrive on its own, when you are ready to let it." The words settled over Eleanor like a warning wrapped gently in kindness, and that night, lying awake in her small room, she understood with growing certainty that the careful walls she had built around her false name were beginning, slowly and quietly, to crack. It was not carelessness on her part. She had been careful every single day. It was simply that the people of Greythorne Hall, the old woman with clouded eyes and sharp ears, and the Duke with his quiet, patient attention, were far more observant than the strangers she had successfully deceived in smaller, less watchful houses before this one. 3 days later, word arrived that the guests for the hunting party would begin arriving within the week, and among the names read aloud by Mrs. Whitfield during the household's preparations was one that made Eleanor's blood turn to ice where she stood in the hallway, a stack of linens forgotten in her arms. "Lord Cavendish," the housekeeper had said, along with 2 other gentlemen from London, "will be staying through the following fortnight." Eleanor did not move for a long moment, staring at nothing, the linens slipping slightly in her grip before she caught them again. Lord Cavendish. The name belonged to one of the very men who had stood, cold and unmoved, in the courtroom gallery the day her father's ruin had been announced to the public. The very man rumored, in whispered conversations she had overheard in her final desperate months in London, to be searching hardest of all for the daughter who had vanished without a trace. He was coming here, to this house. Within days, Eleanor set the linens down carefully on a nearby table, forcing her trembling hands to steady, and walked slowly toward the window at the end of the corridor, staring out at the long gravel drive, where, in a matter of days, a carriage would arrive carrying the one man in all of England, capable of ending the careful, fragile life she had built for herself at Greythorne Hall. She did not know, in that moment, whether to run while she still could, or to trust that the strange, unexpected safety she had begun to feel within these walls, safety built not on secrecy, but on the quiet, watchful kindness of a duke who seemed determined to understand her, might somehow be enough to protect her from what was coming. That evening, she considered packing her small trunk and slipping away before dawn, disappearing into the countryside the way she had disappeared from 3 other households before this one. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed for over an hour, turning the idea over in her mind, weighing the terror of discovery against the strange ache of leaving a place that had, in only a matter of days, begun to feel less like a hiding place and more like something dangerously close to home. In the end, it was Lady Millicent's voice from earlier that stopped her, the gentle promise that the old woman would let the truth arrive in its own time rather than force it into the light. There had been no cruelty in those words, only patience, and patience was something Eleanor had rarely been offered by anyone since her father's death. She thought too of Sebastian's steady presence on the terrace, his quiet insistence that she need not carry her burdens entirely alone, and found that some stubborn, hopeful part of her was unwilling to abandon the possibility that he had meant it. Running had kept her alive for 3 years, but it had also kept her friendless, exhausted, and endlessly afraid. Staying carried its own risk, perhaps the greatest risk of all, but for the first time since her father's arrest, Eleanor found herself weighing that risk against something she had almost forgotten how to want, the chance, however small, of being known and accepted, rather than merely tolerated in silence. She rose before dawn regardless, not to flee, but to walk the eastern gardens alone, while the household still slept, needing the cold morning air to steady her thoughts before the day's demands began. It was there, among the hedgerows still silvered with dew, that she encountered Sebastian, already awake and walking the same path with the restless energy of a man who had also slept poorly. "You are troubled again," he said simply, falling into step beside her without asking permission, as though it were already understood between them that her company was welcome. "I heard the names of the coming guests," she admitted, choosing her words with great care. "London society can be unforgiving to those without connections. I suppose I feel out of place imagining myself among such company, even as a servant standing quietly in the corner of a room." Sebastian considered this for a moment, his eyes on the path ahead. "You need not fear my guests, Miss Hartley. Whatever their opinions of companions and servants, they hold no authority within these walls. This house answers to me, not to London drawing rooms." If only that were fully true, she thought privately, though she said nothing, allowing his reassurance to settle over her like a blanket too thin to keep out the coming cold. They walked in silence for a while longer, and for a few brief, precious minutes, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to peace, even knowing that peace, for her, had never once lasted very long. The carriages began arriving on a gray afternoon, wheels crunching over the gravel drive while footmen hurried to carry trunks and boxes into the great hall. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window, her hands pressed flat against the cool glass, counting each carriage as it approached, dreading the moment she would see a face she recognized step down onto the stones below. She did not have to wait long. The third carriage carried a tall man in a dark traveling coat, his hair graying at the temples, his posture stiff with the particular arrogance of a man who had never once in his life been told no. Even from a distance, even after 3 years, Eleanor recognized Lord Cavendish instantly, and her stomach dropped as though the floor beneath her had vanished entirely. She stepped back from the window quickly, pressing herself against the wall as if the movement alone could erase her from his sight, though she knew he could not possibly have seen her from so far below. Her heart pounded so violently she feared it might be heard through the walls, and for a long moment, she simply stood frozen, breathing hard, trying to remember every careful lesson she had taught herself over the past 3 years about controlling fear before it controlled her. She could not avoid the guests entirely. Her duties required her to remain near Lady Millicent throughout the days ahead, and Lady Millicent, sharp as ever despite her failing eyes, often preferred to sit in the drawing room during the early evenings when guests gathered before supper. Eleanor would have to be present, close enough to be seen, close enough to be recognized, if fate proved as cruel as it so often had been to her. She spent that first evening in a state of careful vigilance, keeping to the edges of rooms, lowering her eyes whenever Lord Cavendish's voice carried across the drawing room, positioning herself always with an easy path to the door should she need to disappear quickly. For a while it seemed her caution had been enough. Lord Cavendish, deep in conversation with Sebastian and 2 other gentlemen about matters of trade and politics, paid the quiet companion in the corner no attention at all. It was on the second evening that her careful luck ran out. Lady Millicent had asked Eleanor to fetch a particular shawl from her chambers, and Eleanor was hurrying back down the long corridor toward the drawing room when she rounded a corner and nearly collided directly with Lord Cavendish himself, who had stepped out for air, a glass of brandy still in his hand. He caught her arm briefly to steady her, an automatic courtesy, and then his eyes settled fully on her face for the first time. Eleanor watched, with a horror she could not disguise quickly enough, as recognition slowly dawned in his expression, his brow furrowing, his eyes narrowing, searching her features as though matching them against a memory he had carried for years. "Forgive me," she said quickly, attempting to step past him, her voice higher and tighter than she intended. "Wait," he said, his hand tightening slightly on her arm, not enough to hurt, but enough to hold her in place. "I know your face." He tilted his head, studying her with growing certainty. "Ashworth. You are the Ashworth girl." Eleanor's blood ran cold, but she forced her expression into confusion, shaking her head. "I am afraid you are mistaken, my lord. My name is Hartley." "A false name changes nothing about a true face," he said quietly, his voice low enough that no one passing in the hallway would overhear, though the threat in it was unmistakable. "I sat across from your father in that courtroom, girl. I watched him refuse, until his final breath, to tell us where the money had gone. I have spent 3 years wondering what became of his clever, careful daughter, and here you are, hiding in a duke's household under a servant's name." "I do not know what you are speaking of," Eleanor said, though her voice trembled despite every effort to steady it. Lord Cavendish smiled thinly, releasing her arm at last. "Perhaps you do not need to speak of it at all. Perhaps you simply need to listen." He stepped closer, lowering his voice further still. You will leave this house quietly before the week is out, and you will never again involve yourself with families of consequence. Do this, and I see no reason to trouble the Duke with the truth of who shares his home. Refuse, and I promise you, every door in England will close to you within a fortnight, along with whatever fragile peace you believe you have found here." He straightened his coat, gave her a final measuring look, and walked away down the corridor as though nothing at all had happened, leaving Eleanor standing alone, trembling, the shawl for Lady Millicent forgotten in her clenched hands. She did not return immediately to the drawing room. Instead, she slipped into a small, unused parlor nearby and sat down heavily on the edge of a chair, pressing both hands over her mouth to keep from making a sound. 3 years of careful hiding, undone in a single hallway encounter. She thought of packing her trunk that very night, of vanishing before dawn as she had done so many times before, but something in her rebelled fiercely against the idea this time, some stubborn ember of anger she had not expected to find still burning inside her. Why should she run again? Why should she disappear, friendless and afraid, simply because a cruel man wished to protect the secrets of his own dishonest dealings by silencing the daughter of the man he had ruined to protect himself? She sat with that anger for a long while, letting it steady her shaking hands, until at last she rose, straightened her dress, and made her way back toward the drawing room, determined not to let Lord Cavendish see even a flicker of the fear he had planted in her. But her composure, however carefully rebuilt, did not go unnoticed. Sebastian, watching from across the room as she returned later than expected, her face pale beneath its careful calm, felt a sharp and immediate concern rise in his chest. He excused himself from a conversation about hunting grounds and crossed the room toward her, keeping his voice low as he reached her side. "You are unwell," he said quietly, no question in his tone, only certainty. "I am simply tired, Your Grace," she answered, the familiar lie falling automatically from her lips, though even as she spoke it, she felt the exhaustion of maintaining it for the 100th time settle heavily over her. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving briefly toward Lord Cavendish, who stood laughing loudly at something across the room, and something in his expression sharpened, some quiet calculation working behind his steady gaze. "Did Lord Cavendish speak to you this evening?" he asked carefully. Eleanor's breath caught, but she forced herself to answer smoothly. "He offered only a passing greeting. Your Grace, nothing of consequence." Sebastian did not press further in that moment, though the tension in his shoulders told her he did not fully believe the answer. He remained close to her for the rest of the evening, finding small reasons to linger nearby, and though he said nothing more of the matter that night, Eleanor understood, with growing dread, that he had noticed enough to begin asking his own quiet questions. 2 days passed in careful, watchful tension. Eleanor avoided being alone in any corridor where Lord Cavendish might find her, keeping always to rooms with others present, arriving early and leaving late to avoid any chance encounter. But avoidance, she soon learned, could not protect her forever in a house full of people who noticed everything. It happened on the 3rd night, during a small gathering in the music room, where Lady Millicent had insisted on hearing one of the younger guests play the pianoforte. Eleanor stood near the back of the room, half hidden behind a tall potted plant, when she felt a presence settle beside her, and turned to find Lord Cavendish once more, his expression pleasant for the benefit of anyone watching, though his eyes carried the same cold threat as before. "Have you considered my offer?" he said quietly, his voice barely above the music filling the room. "I owe you nothing," Eleanor answered, keeping her own voice equally low, equally controlled, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "You owe me silence," he corrected softly. "Your father's debts did not vanish simply because he did. There are men who still believe you hold answers to questions I would very much prefer remained buried. Leave quietly, and this ends. Stay, and I promise you I will make certain the Duke learns exactly what sort of viper he has welcomed into his aunt's company." Before Eleanor could formulate a response, a voice spoke from directly behind them, calm, controlled, and unmistakably furious beneath its careful composure. "I believe," Sebastian said, stepping into view, "that whatever business you have with my aunt's companion can wait until you have properly explained yourself to me, Lord Cavendish." Cavendish's expression flickered with brief surprise before settling into practiced ease. "Merely offering the young woman some friendly advice about her future prospects, Your Grace. Nothing more." Sebastian's eyes moved briefly to Eleanor, taking in her pale face, her tightly clenched hands, and something in his expression hardened with quiet resolve. "Miss Hartley," he said gently, "would you excuse us for a moment?" Eleanor nodded and stepped away quickly, though she did not go far, lingering near the doorway where she could still hear the low, tense murmur of voices behind her, unable to make out the words but recognizing clearly the shift in tone. Sebastian's voice growing sharper, Cavendish's growing defensive, until at last Sebastian returned to her side, his jaw tight, his eyes searching her face with new intensity. "We will speak privately tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "I think it is time, Miss Hartley, that you tell me the truth." That night, Eleanor barely slept, turning over every possible outcome in her mind, weighing confession against flight one final time. But when morning came, she found herself walking toward the small study where Sebastian had asked to meet her, her decision already made somewhere deep within her exhausted heart. She was tired of running, tired of lying, tired most of all, of carrying a truth so heavy that it had begun to feel like the only thing left of her father's memory worth protecting. Sebastian rose from behind his desk when she entered, gesturing toward a chair, his expression neither angry nor accusing, only patient, waiting. "I already suspect a great deal," he said quietly once she was seated. "I would rather hear the truth from you than continue guessing at shadows, Miss Hartley, if that is even your true name." Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap, but she lifted her chin, meeting his steady gaze directly for the first time in weeks. "It is not," she said softly. "My name is Eleanor Ashworth. My father was a solicitor in London, accused 3 years ago of crimes I do not believe he committed, crimes that ended with his death before any trial could clear his name. Lord Cavendish was among the men who benefited most from his ruin, and he has believed ever since that I hold secrets capable of exposing the truth of what really happened." "Do you?" Sebastian asked quietly, no judgment in his voice, only careful attention. "I hold nothing but grief," Eleanor answered, her voice breaking slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I have no hidden money, no secret papers, nothing at all that Lord Cavendish fears I possess. I only ever wanted to disappear quietly enough that men like him would forget I existed. I never intended to deceive you, Your Grace. I only intended to survive." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, and Eleanor braced herself for anger, for dismissal, for the sound of her carefully built world finally, completely collapsing around her. Instead, he rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, his voice gentle when he finally spoke again. "I suspected far more than this," he admitted quietly. "I feared, at times, that you carried some scandal of your own making. Instead, I find only a woman who has survived 3 years of cruelty inflicted by men too cowardly to face their own guilt honestly." He paused, his eyes steady on hers. "Your name changes nothing about the person I have come to know these past weeks, Miss Ashworth. If anything, it explains a great deal I could not previously understand." Eleanor stared up at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing, relief and disbelief warring fiercely in her chest. You do not intend to send me away." "Send you away," Sebastian repeated, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth despite the seriousness of the moment. "No, Miss Ashworth, I intend to see that Lord Cavendish never again has the opportunity to threaten you beneath my roof, or anywhere else for that matter." For the first time in 3 long years, Eleanor allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that perhaps she had finally found someone willing to stand beside her rather than simply survive her presence. And though she knew Lord Cavendish would not surrender so easily, the fear that had gripped her chest for days finally, slowly, began to loosen its hold. Sebastian remained standing near her chair a moment longer, his expression thoughtful now rather than troubled, as though his mind had already begun turning toward the practical matter of dealing with Lord Cavendish. "Tell me everything you can remember of the accusations against your father," he said finally, returning to his seat behind the desk and drawing a sheet of paper toward him. "Names, dates, any detail at all, however small it may seem to you. A man like Cavendish does not build a false accusation without leaving some trace of his own guilt behind him." Eleanor hesitated, unused to being asked for the truth so directly after years of guarding it so carefully. But slowly, haltingly, she began to speak, describing the missing ledgers her father had once mentioned in a worried letter, the sudden wealth Lord Cavendish had acquired in the months following the scandal, the way 2 other solicitors who might have testified in her father's defense had quietly left London before the trial ever began. Sebastian listened without interruption, writing occasional notes, his expression growing more serious with each detail she offered. "This is more than enough to begin asking careful questions of my own," he said once she had finished. "I have connections in London who owe me favors, men who understand finance and law far better than most magistrates care to admit publicly. If Lord Cavendish built his fortune on your father's ruin, there will be a trail somewhere, however carefully hidden. Such men are rarely as clever as they believe themselves to be." "You would truly do this?" Eleanor asked quietly, still hardly able to accept the shift in her circumstances. "You would risk your own name, associating yourself with a scandal not your own, simply to help me." Sebastian set down his pen and met her eyes directly. "I find, Miss Ashworth, that I would rather risk association with an honest scandal than continue pretending I have not already involved myself in your welfare these past weeks." He allowed himself a small, wry smile. "Besides, I have never particularly cared for Lord Cavendish. I find this an excellent excuse to finally investigate a man whose company I have long found distasteful." Despite everything, despite the fear still lingering at the edges of her thoughts, Eleanor felt a small, unfamiliar laugh escape her, quickly followed by tears she had not expected, relief finally breaking through the composure she had maintained for so long. Sebastian did not move to comfort her physically, understanding instinctively that she needed the space to simply feel the emotion without further scrutiny, but he remained seated quietly nearby, offering his presence as a steady, wordless comfort until she had gathered herself once more. "We must proceed carefully," he said gently once she had composed herself. "Lord Cavendish must not suspect how much we already know. Not until I have gathered proof enough to make any accusation of his against you entirely powerless. Can you continue as you have, for a little while longer, without revealing what has passed between us this morning?" "I have had 3 years of practice concealing far more difficult truths than this," Eleanor answered, managing a small, tired smile of her own. "I believe I can manage a few days more." Sebastian nodded, satisfied, though his eyes carried a new determination as she rose to leave, a determination Eleanor recognized as the particular resolve of a man who had decided, fully and completely, to fight a battle that was no longer only hers to face alone. 3 days after their conversation in the study, a letter arrived for Sebastian carried by a private rider rather than the usual post, and Eleanor watched from across the breakfast room as his expression shifted from careful patience into something colder and far more focused while he read it. He folded the letter quickly, tucking it into his coat, and caught her eye briefly across the room, a small, deliberate nod passing between them that told her, without a single word spoken aloud, that the investigation had finally produced results worth acting upon. He found her later that afternoon in the eastern garden, where she had taken to walking during the quiet hours when Lady Millicent rested. His expression, though controlled, carried an intensity she had not seen in him before, and she felt her pulse quicken as he approached. "My associate in London has confirmed what I suspected," he said without preamble. "Lord Cavendish did not simply benefit from your father's ruin, Miss Ashworth. He orchestrated it. The missing funds your father was accused of stealing were transferred, through a series of carefully disguised accounts, directly into holdings Cavendish quietly acquired within months of the trial. Your father's own signature was forged onto documents he never saw, likely by a clerk since dismissed from Cavendish's service, and now conveniently residing overseas." Eleanor's breath caught, her hand pressing instinctively against her chest, as though she could physically hold in the flood of emotion the news released within her. 3 years of grief, of running, of believing herself somehow responsible for whatever suspicion had fallen upon her father, and now, finally, proof that none of it had ever been true. "Can this be proven?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Truly proven, before others?" "The documents my associate has gathered are substantial," Sebastian answered carefully. "Enough, I believe, to bring formal questions before the proper authorities, though such matters move slowly, and men of Cavendish's standing rarely fall easily. However," he continued, his expression sharpening further, "I have found something perhaps even more immediately useful. Lord Cavendish has been quietly borrowing heavily against those very holdings for over a year now, debts he has kept carefully hidden from London society, debts that, if made known at the wrong moment, would ruin his reputation among the very men whose trust he depends upon for his continued influence." Eleanor studied him carefully, beginning to understand the shape of what he was proposing. "You intend to use this against him directly, rather than waiting for slower justice to run its course." "I intend," Sebastian said quietly, "to ensure that Lord Cavendish understands clearly that any attempt to expose you will be met immediately with the exposure of his own far greater sins. Men like him do not fear justice, Miss Ashworth, not truly. They fear humiliation. They fear the whispers of their peers far more than they fear any court. I intend to make certain he understands precisely what he stands to lose should he continue his threats against you." That evening, during a small gathering before supper, Sebastian requested a private word with Lord Cavendish, and Eleanor, though not present for the conversation itself, watched from a distance as the two men withdrew to the library, Cavendish's easy confidence visibly faltering the moment the door closed behind them. She did not learn the full details of what passed between them until much later that night, when Sebastian sought her out once the household had finally settled into quiet. He no longer smiles quite so easily, Sebastian said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice as he found her in the small sitting room where she had been waiting, unable to sleep until she knew the outcome. I informed him plainly that I possessed documentation of his financial dealings sufficient to ruin him thoroughly among his own circle, and that this documentation would find its way into very particular hands the moment any word of your true identity reached beyond these walls. He paused. I believe he understood me clearly. And if he does not honor this understanding, Eleanor asked quietly, if his fear of you does not outweigh his need to silence me, then I will ensure the documents reach London regardless, Sebastian answered simply. Either path leads to his downfall, Miss Ashworth. I have simply given him the choice between a downfall that comes quietly, or one that comes with considerably more noise attached to his name. Eleanor sat with this for a long moment, marveling quietly at the transformation in her circumstances over the span of only a few short days. Why? She asked finally, her voice softer now. Why involve yourself so deeply in this? You risk your own reputation, your own standing, for a companion you have known only a matter of weeks. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with obvious care. I have managed this estate since I was young, he said finally. I have spent years surrounded by men who value only what they can gain from a person, who measure worth entirely in terms of usefulness or connection or wealth. In you, Miss Ashworth, I find none of that calculation. I find only a woman who has survived cruelty with remarkable grace, who reads to my aunt with genuine patience rather than obligation, who has shown more honest kindness in a matter of weeks than most of my acquaintances manage in years. He met her eyes steadily. I find that reason enough. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion she did not trust herself to voice aloud, and for a long moment, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly in the hearth nearby, the weight of the previous weeks beginning, at last, to lift slightly from her shoulders. The following days passed with visible tension between Lord Cavendish and the rest of the household, though he maintained his public composure carefully, aware now that any misstep would bring consequences he could not afford. He avoided Eleanor entirely, no longer seeking her out in quiet corridors, no longer offering veiled threats disguised as friendly advice. But Eleanor remained watchful still, unwilling to fully trust in a peace so recently and precariously secured. It was Lady Millicent, perceptive as ever despite her clouded eyes, who finally addressed the matter directly one quiet afternoon, as Eleanor read to her in the small sitting room. She set down her needlework abruptly, interrupting Eleanor mid-sentence. You may stop pretending with me now, child, she said gently. I have known for some time that you carried a heavier truth than the one you offered upon your arrival. I did not press, because I believed you would share it when you were ready, and because, frankly, I found I did not particularly care what name you carried, so long as the woman behind it continued to treat me with the kindness you have shown these past weeks. Eleanor lowered the book slowly, studying the old woman's face with quiet surprise. You knew? She asked softly. Not the particulars, Lady Millicent admitted, but enough to understand you were running from something, and running from something does not make a person dishonest, my dear. It simply makes them frightened. I have watched my nephew grow fond of you these past weeks, watched the way his patience for you extends further than his patience for nearly anyone else in this house, and I confess, I have grown equally fond of you myself. Whatever your true name, whatever burden brought you to my door, you have become dear to this household, and I will not see that undone by the schemes of a man like Cavendish. Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly at the old woman's words, touched deeply by an acceptance she had not dared to hope for. Thank you, my lady, she whispered. You cannot know what these words mean to me. I believe I can imagine well enough, Lady Millicent said, reaching out to pat Eleanor's hand gently. Now, dry your eyes, child, and continue the reading. I find I am rather eager to learn how the story ends. Word of the tension between the Duke and Lord Cavendish inevitably reached the wider household staff, and Eleanor noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle but unmistakable shift in how the servants treated her. Where once there had been quiet suspicion, whispered questions about a companion too well spoken for her station, there now grew a kind of protective loyalty, as though the staff of Greythorne Hall had collectively decided, without ever discussing it openly, that whatever her true history, she belonged among them now, and they would not easily allow a visiting lord to threaten one of their own. Mrs. Whitfield, never one for open displays of warmth, began including small extra courtesies in her daily routines, ensuring Eleanor's room received fresh linens without being asked, setting aside a particularly fine cut of meat from the kitchen on evenings when the household dined well. The gesture was small, but Eleanor understood its meaning clearly, and found herself grateful in ways too deep for easy words. By the time the hunting party guests began departing at the close of the fortnight, Lord Cavendish among the first to leave, his farewell to Sebastian stiff and formal, entirely lacking his earlier easy confidence, Eleanor understood that whatever fragile peace had been secured within Greythorne Hall's walls, it had been won not through her hiding, but through finally allowing herself to be seen, protected, and believed by people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to stand beside her. Yet even as Cavendish's carriage rolled away down the long gravel drive, disappearing at last beyond the stone gates, Eleanor knew the matter was not fully finished. A man like Cavendish, humiliated and cornered, was rarely content to simply retreat quietly into obscurity, and some quiet, cautious part of her wondered what final move he might yet attempt before this chapter of her life could truly be considered closed. Her caution proved well-founded. Barely a week after the guests had departed, Sebastian received word from his associate in London that Lord Cavendish had begun quietly making inquiries of his own, attempting to learn whether the documents threatening him had already been shared with any magistrate or newspaper, testing the boundaries of the warning he had received. It was, Sebastian explained grimly to Eleanor one evening, precisely the kind of behavior he had expected from a man unwilling to accept defeat without first testing whether the threat against him carried real weight. "He is searching for a way around you," Eleanor said, understanding immediately what such inquiries meant. "He wishes to know if he can still act against me without consequence." "Then we must remove all doubt from his mind," Sebastian answered, and within days, he had arranged for a carefully worded letter to be delivered directly to Lord Cavendish's London residence, accompanied by copies, not originals, of the most damaging financial records his associate had gathered, along with a clear and unambiguous statement that the originals rested securely in the hands of men who would act immediately and publicly, should any harm come to Miss Ashworth's reputation, safety, or standing. The response, when it came, arrived not as a letter but as silence, complete and total, from Lord Cavendish himself. No further inquiries reached London on the subject of Eleanor's identity. No further threats found their way, even indirectly, back to Greythorne Hall. Sebastian's associate confirmed, some weeks later, that Cavendish had quietly begun restructuring his most troublesome debts, behavior consistent with a man who had finally accepted that any further aggression would cost him considerably more than he stood to gain. Eleanor allowed herself, slowly and carefully, to believe that the danger had truly passed. It was not the sudden, triumphant relief she might once have imagined for herself in quieter, more hopeful days before her father's arrest, but something steadier, something earned through patience and the loyalty of people who had chosen to stand beside her, rather than abandon her to face her enemies alone. She found herself sleeping more soundly at night, no longer startling at the sound of unfamiliar carriage wheels on distant roads, no longer rehearsing false explanations for her name before every new conversation. Lady Millicent noticed the change most keenly of all, remarking one afternoon, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who enjoyed being proven right, that Eleanor's shoulders had finally begun to lose the tightness she had carried since her very first day at Greythorne Hall. "You walk like a woman no longer expecting the ground to give way beneath her," the old woman observed fondly. "It suits you a great deal better than the careful stillness you arrived with." Sebastian, too, seemed lighter in her presence during those following weeks. The careful watchfulness that had once defined his attention toward her softening gradually into something warmer, something neither of them named aloud but both seemed increasingly unwilling to deny. Their evening walks in the garden grew longer, their conversations drifting further from careful pleasantries into genuine curiosity about one another's thoughts, memories, and hopes for whatever future might yet unfold. And though Eleanor understood that her true name had only recently been reclaimed, spoken aloud within these walls for the first time in 3 long years, she found herself, for the first time since her father's death, beginning to imagine a future in which that name might finally be allowed to simply belong to her, openly and without fear, in the eyes of the world beyond Greythorne Hall's quiet, protective walls. Autumn arrived at Greythorne Hall with a sudden sharpness in the morning air, and Eleanor stood once more at the window of her small room, watching leaves turn gold and copper across the wide lawns below, remembering with quiet wonder how different this same view had felt to her only months earlier, when every falling leaf had seemed like a warning rather than simply the turning of a season. So much had changed since that first frightened arrival, and yet the house itself remained exactly as grand and steady as it had always been, a constant backdrop against which her own life had quietly, cautiously, begun to heal. She had continued her duties as companion to Lady Millicent throughout those weeks, though the nature of her position within the household had shifted in ways neither she nor anyone else spoke of directly, yet everyone seemed to understand regardless. She no longer took her meals apart from the family in strict observance of a servant's boundaries, invited instead, with increasing frequency, to join Sebastian and Lady Millicent at the smaller family table, where conversation flowed easily and laughter, something Eleanor had once believed lost to her entirely, returned gradually into her daily life. It was on a crisp morning in early October that Sebastian found her once again in the eastern garden, the same path where their earliest quiet conversations had first begun to shift the careful distance between them into something warmer. He carried himself differently that morning, she noticed immediately, a certain nervous energy beneath his usually steady composure that made her heart quicken with curious anticipation before he had even spoken a single word. "I have given a great deal of thought to your future, Miss Ashworth," he began, and Eleanor felt a flicker of old anxiety at the formality of his tone, though it faded quickly as she studied his face and found none of the careful distance such words might once have carried. "My future," she repeated carefully, uncertain where the conversation intended to lead. Sebastian stopped walking, turning to face her fully, and for a moment his usual careful control seemed to waver entirely, replaced by something far more vulnerable than she had ever seen him allow himself to show. "I have spent these past months," he said slowly, watching a woman rebuild her courage from nothing but sheer determination and quiet dignity, watching her care for my aunt with genuine tenderness, watching her face down threats that would have broken far less resilient spirits entirely. "I did not intend, when you first arrived at this house, to find myself so thoroughly changed by your presence within it. And yet here I am, entirely unable to imagine this house, or my own life within it, without you continuing to be part of both." Eleanor's breath caught, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning correctly, though the steady warmth in his eyes left little room for misunderstanding. "Your Grace," she began softly, uncertain how to continue. "Sebastian," he corrected gently. "I think after everything we have faced together these past months, you might finally allow yourself to call me by my name, rather than my title." "Sebastian," she repeated, testing the word carefully, feeling something loosen further within her chest at the simple intimacy of it. "I am asking you," he continued, his voice steady now despite the vulnerability still visible in his expression, "to remain at Greythorne Hall not as a companion to my aunt, but as my wife, if you will have me. I know your name carries a history not entirely your own making, a history some in society may still whisper about despite the truth we have worked to uncover. I do not care for their whispers, Eleanor. I care only for the woman standing before me now, the one who survived cruelty with more grace than most people manage in comfort, and who I find myself, against every careful expectation I once held for my own life, entirely and completely in love with." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, though for the first time in 3 long years they carried no trace of fear within them, only overwhelming relief and joy so profound she found herself momentarily unable to speak at all. When she finally found her voice, it emerged soft but entirely certain. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you." He crossed the remaining distance between them and took her hands gently in his own, his expression breaking into a smile so genuine and unguarded that Eleanor felt, in that single moment, as though every difficult year that had led her to this garden, this house, this man, had somehow been worth enduring simply to arrive at this particular morning. News of their engagement spread quickly through Greythorne Hall, and the household's reaction confirmed everything Eleanor had begun to hope true over the preceding months. Mrs. Whitfield, upon hearing the announcement, allowed herself an actual smile, rare enough that several younger servants remarked upon it for days afterward. The staff, who had once regarded the too well-spoken companion with quiet suspicion, now moved through the halls with a kind of proud excitement, as though Eleanor's happiness had somehow become a shared achievement belonging to the entire household, rather than to her alone. Lady Millicent, upon learning the news, simply nodded with evident satisfaction, as though the outcome had never truly been in doubt. "I knew from the very first afternoon," she said, patting Eleanor's hand fondly, "that you were far too interesting to remain merely my companion for long. I am only glad my nephew possessed enough sense to recognize what was standing directly in front of him." Word of the engagement, however, inevitably traveled beyond the walls of Greythorne Hall and into the wider circles of society, carrying with it renewed murmurs about Eleanor's true identity, questions about the daughter of a disgraced solicitor, now set to become a duchess. Sebastian, anticipating exactly this reaction, moved carefully and deliberately to address it before rumor could shape the narrative in ways neither of them could control. He arranged, through careful correspondence with several respected figures in London, including a magistrate sympathetic to matters of genuine injustice, for the evidence gathered against Lord Cavendish to be formally presented, not merely as leverage held privately over one man, but as a proper accounting of the truth long overdue. The process moved slowly, as such matters often did, but within weeks, whispers began circulating through London society of an entirely different nature. Whispers questioning not the daughter's honesty, but the truth behind her father's original ruin, and the convenient fortune Lord Cavendish had built upon it. Lord Cavendish, faced now with public scrutiny he could no longer control or contain through private threats alone, found his standing among his own circle deteriorating rapidly. Invitations grew scarce. Business partners, wary of association with a man now openly suspected of financial deception, began quietly withdrawing their support. Whatever fate ultimately awaited him through formal proceedings, Eleanor found she cared for it very little. What mattered far more was that her father's name, spoken now in London drawing rooms, carried increasingly the weight of a man wronged rather than a man guilty, a small but meaningful restoration of the truth she had feared might never see daylight again. The wedding took place in early winter, in the small stone chapel at the edge of the Greythorne estate, its windows frosted delicately at the edges, candlelight warming the interior against the cold gray afternoon outside. Eleanor wore a simple gown of pale blue, insisting on modesty despite Sebastian's gentle protests that she deserved the finest silks London could offer, and as she walked the short aisle toward him, she carried in her hands not a bouquet of flowers, but the small silver locket she had once guarded so carefully in secret, now worn openly at her throat for the first time since her father's death. Lady Millicent sat in the front pew, her clouded eyes bright with unmistakable emotion despite their limitations, her hand resting proudly on her walking stick, as though she alone had orchestrated the entire match from the very beginning, which, in her own quiet way over the preceding months, she rather believed she had. Mrs. Whitfield stood near the back among the assembled household staff, dabbing discreetly at her eyes with a handkerchief she would later deny needing at all. As Sebastian took her hands before the small gathered assembly, his eyes steady and warm upon her face, Eleanor felt the last remaining traces of the fear that had defined her existence for 3 long years finally, completely dissolve, replaced by something far steadier and infinitely more precious. She thought briefly of her father, of the quiet dignity with which he had faced his own unjust ending, and hoped, with quiet certainty, that he would have found comfort in knowing his daughter had finally found not merely safety, but genuine belonging, in a house and among people who had chosen her freely, fully, and without any hidden motive at all. The ceremony concluded with quiet vows spoken clearly before witnesses who had, each in their own way, become something like family to her over the preceding months, and as Sebastian leaned down to seal their union with a gentle kiss, the small chapel filled with warm applause and genuine, unguarded joy from everyone gathered within it. In the months that followed, Eleanor Ashworth, now Duchess of Greythorne, settled fully into a life she had once believed impossible to imagine for herself. She continued spending afternoons with Lady Millicent, though now as family rather than employment, reading together not out of obligation but out of genuine affection that had only deepened with time. She walked the gardens each morning beside her husband, no longer watching the roads with fear, but simply enjoying the quiet beauty of a life, finally, fully her own. Lord Cavendish's fate, when it finally arrived through the slow machinery of formal proceedings, brought Eleanor a quiet sense of closure rather than triumph. The truth of her father's innocence recorded properly at last, his name spoken now with sympathy rather than suspicion among those who remembered the scandal at all. She visited her father's modest grave that spring, laying flowers gently upon it, speaking softly of everything that had changed since the last time she had stood there, grieving and afraid, uncertain whether she would survive the years ahead at all. She had survived, not merely through hiding and running, but ultimately through the courage to be truly seen, by an old woman with failing eyes and an unfailing heart, by a household that had chosen loyalty over suspicion, and by a duke who had looked past every careful disguise she wore and recognized, from the very first evening, the honest woman hidden beneath it. That summer, Sebastian arranged a quiet journey to the coast, away from the demands of the estate and the lingering curiosity of London society, a chance for the two of them to simply exist together, without the weight of titles or scandal pressing upon either of them. They walked along windswept cliffs overlooking grey water, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor spoke freely of her childhood, of afternoons spent in her father's study, while he explained the careful workings of contracts and ledgers, of the small kindnesses he had shown to clients who could not always afford his services, of the man he had truly been before the world reduced him to a single scandal that was never his to carry. Sebastian listened to every story with quiet attention, asking gentle questions that allowed her to remember her father, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a whole person, flawed and human and deeply loved. And Eleanor found, in sharing these memories aloud for the first time in years, a healing she had not realized she still needed. Grief, she discovered, did not disappear simply because justice had finally arrived. It merely changed shape, becoming something she could carry more gently, surrounded now by people willing to help her hold its weight. Upon their return to Greythorne Hall, Eleanor found herself drawn increasingly into matters beyond her role as companion or wife, taking a genuine interest in the tenants who worked the estate's surrounding lands, many of whom she had come to know during her early months there, while walking the grounds to steady her nerves. She began quietly advocating for improvements to the small tenant cottages, for fairer arrangements regarding harvest shares, applying the careful attention to detail she had once used to survive discovery towards something far more constructive. And Sebastian, rather than dismissing her involvement, welcomed it eagerly, recognizing in her a partner whose judgment he had come to trust as thoroughly as his own. Lady Millicent, meanwhile, continued to hold court each afternoon in her favorite sitting room, though her stories increasingly turned toward reminiscing about the early days of Eleanor's arrival, embellishing certain details with each retelling, until the household staff teased that the old woman had practically predicted the entire romance from the very moment Eleanor first stepped through the front doors. "She is not entirely wrong to claim credit," Sebastian admitted to Eleanor privately one evening, laughing softly. "She did tell me, within a week of your arrival, that I would be a great fool to let you leave this house unmarried. And you did not believe her at the time," Eleanor teased gently. "I believed her entirely," Sebastian admitted. "I simply required a bit more time to work up the courage to act upon it properly." As the years that followed unfolded gently across the seasons, Greythorne Hall filled gradually with new sounds, laughter echoing through corridors that had once felt cold and watchful to a frightened young woman arriving with nothing but a locked trunk and a borrowed name. Eleanor often found herself standing at the same upstairs window where she had first watched Lord Cavendish's carriage arrive with such dread, though now the view brought her only quiet contentment, watching instead for the return of her husband from estate business, or for the children who would, in time, come to fill the halls with their own curious footsteps and endless questions. She kept the small silver locket always, passing its story eventually to her own children as they grew old enough to understand it, teaching them not to fear the difficult chapters of a person's history, but to recognize that such chapters, however painful, often shape the strength required to build something lasting and true afterward. She spoke honestly, in time, of her father's name, ensuring it was remembered within her own family not with shame, but with the quiet pride of a man who had faced injustice with dignity, and whose daughter had ultimately carried his memory into a life he would have been proud to witness. Greythorne Hall itself seemed to soften around her presence over those years, the old portraits lining its corridors no longer feeling like watching eyes to a frightened newcomer, but familiar faces belonging now to her own family's history as much as Sebastian's. Visitors to the estate often remarked upon the warmth of the household, the easy laughter shared between the Duke and Duchess, the evident affection the staff held for a mistress who had never forgotten what it meant to be an outsider seeking simple kindness in unfamiliar surroundings. Standing now in the gardens of Greythorne Hall as the first warm days of another spring returned once more to the estate, Eleanor understood finally that the truth, however long buried, however fiercely threatened, had a way of finding its way into the light when enough people cared enough to protect it, and that sometimes, the very thing a person spends years running from, turns out to be the very thing that finally leads them home.